Hey adventurers, so today is going to be our end of the year wrap up, or kind of like our top 10 reads of the year as well. First thing I want to do is go through a couple of my stats that I had for the year. I think I read 101 books if I am counting correctly, and 8 of those were physical, which is not very good. 2 of them were ebooks, and so the rest of that, what is that, 89 of them were audiobooks, I think, if my math is correct there. No, it should have been 91.
It's okay, I told people the wrong percentage in
91.
the last video.
Anyways, I think it was 91 of the books were audiobooks, which is a lot of audiobooks, but I had my job that I was working, I could sit at my job and listen to an audiobook for 4 to 6 hours a day pretty much, and so I can get through a lot of audiobooks at that point. Do you have stats?
Yeah, I read a total of 58 books this year, which is a bit less than last year. I think I read like 80, 88 or something. I was shooting for 100 and I was well on track for the beginning of the year, and then my schedule changed, so I wasn't able to read as quickly as I was before. I don't separate my books between ebook and physical books, or audiobook and ebook physical, so I don't have any numbers as far as that goes.
The only reason I did it is because I wanted to see how bad I did at physically reading. Alright, so now we'll go through our top 10 of, and we want to go 10 to 1 I think, of the...
Oh, we're supposed to rate them? Mine aren't rated.
That's fine.
Mine aren't
most
rated.
of them aren't really rated, other than the top 4, kind of, definitely the top 4, possibly all tied for number 1 type thing. So in the slot that I put as number 10, I have The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. And this is a classic sci-fi novella, I think, and I really enjoyed it. I don't know, when I was going through the list, I wanted to have another classic on here, and I was thinking and trying to find a book that really resonated with me, and the ones that were coming to mind were Alice in Wonderland and Around the World in 80 Days and The Time Machine. And of those 3, The Time Machine was the one that's kept coming to the top of those 3, and me thinking that that's the one that I enjoyed the most. So that's why it's on here.
That one didn't make it on my list this year. But I read, let's start with the one on top, The Wonderland Trials by Sarah Ella. I've always loved Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass. I really love the world, and I think last year I reread Alice, maybe both of them. I think I reread them both. So I was excited to read this one. The author did such a good job of making the characters from Lewis Carroll's book, his story, come alive in this retelling. So it was just so much fun, and I love the type of trial game type of setting. It's very fun.
As the number 9 slot, I have The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper. And I was debating between this one and The Deerslayer because I really liked The Deerslayer and I had a great experience with reading that one. But I think, even though the experience of listening to Last of the Mohicans wasn't as good, I think I enjoyed the story itself more, and so that's why I ended up putting Last of the Mohicans on above The Deerslayer. But that's the next book.
One of the books that made it on my top 10 list is Activated by Nova McBee. The Calculated series is one of my favorite series, and while Activated isn't my favorite in the series, it's part of the series, and I read it this year, so it counts.
It would have been on mine, except that I had already read it. It would have been a reread. And I didn't put any rereads on this list, which is why so many things like The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings aren't on here. Then I have Bone Trout. This is book 2 of the Collation Saga by Andrew D. Meredith. I read the first book, which is Deathless Beast, in the end of 2022, and then Bone Trout pretty much as soon as it came out in 2023. And then I read book 3, which is Gloves of Eons, and I actually read 1, 2, and 3 again in preparation. 1 and 2 again in preparation for 3 when 3 came out, and so Bone Trout is on here because I read it for the first time this year, and I think I enjoyed it just a little bit more than Gloves of Eons. I really like Gloves of Eons and a lot of what it was doing, but I think my just sheer enjoyment of the book goes to Bone Trout more. So.
I also read The Pharaoh's Daughter by Misu Andrews. I really love this book. It's a historical fiction about Moses' mother, not his biological mother, the Pharaoh's daughter who adopted Moses. So it was about her story, though, not Moses's, and it was really, really such a fun read. I love reading Bible historical fiction, and I think that the author did a really good job. And she found one verse in the Bible that mentions the Pharaoh's daughter and who she married, and it was just very interesting to dive a little bit deeper and to see a section of biblical time come to life in a fictional story, or a story that was based on reality, but we don't of course have all these details.
The next one is Stones of Light. This is the second book in the Threadlight trilogy. I read the first book last year, I think, and then I reread the first book so that I could read the second and third book and finish out the series this year. And of the three books, I think Stones of Light is my favorite, mostly because there was just something about, there's one specific point in book 3 that took my enjoyment down a little bit, and because of that, just the having no issues pretty much with book 2 makes that come out on top. And I really did enjoy the whole series, but I think book 2 is my favorite of the series.
I also read Secrets in the Mist by Morgan L. Bousset, or Morgan Bus, I don't know how her last name's said, I'm sorry. But I love this book. This was a book that had the worst cliffhanger ever. I actually picked up the second book in the series, and if you guys remember at all from my reading habits, I'm not a series person. Like, if I read the first book in the series and it was good, great, that's wonderful, good for them, but I'm not likely to pick up the second book. This one was so much fun. I loved the world, I loved the setting, I loved the themes and the story. It was so much fun.
Finally, I can start holding up books because I own, I think, the rest of them on this, or have access to the rest of them on this list, and that is Sons of the Oak by David Farland. This is the 5th book in the Runelord series. I read books 2 through 8 this year, and so read the majority of the series this year, and Sons of the Oak was my favorite of that series. It's the start of a new, or it's kind of like a bridge book between two story arcs that are going on, but it's also the start of a new story arc. And it feels a lot like a book 1, but it's also built upon what's been built upon in the series so far, and just kind of everything about it worked really well, and the way that the story was being told, it ended up being my favorite of the series, and I enjoyed the whole series as it was, but this one is just my favorite of the series. So
I also read Mortal Sight by Sandra Fernandez Rhodes. I love this story. It takes a lot of quotes and a lot of the world from John, Paradise Lost by John
Milton?
Yes, John Milton, good job. It takes a lot of phrases and characters from that and incorporates it not in a retelling, but in a very thought-provoking way in the world and in the story. One of my absolute favorite books of the year. I want to reread it now that I'm thinking about it and looking at it again, and I'm really, really excited. I haven't read the second book in the series, which is also out, so very excited to read that one, but definitely one of my favorite books of the year.
And then I've got Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. This is a classic book, and it is a sci-fi dystopian novel. Kind of very well known because it's the premise of it is kind of that there's firemen who their job is to burn books, not to put out fires. And everybody's read this book, everybody knows about this book, except me. I hadn't read it, and so I wanted to read it, and I really, really enjoyed it. It's not, I didn't enjoy it as much as Something Wicked This Way Comes, which was the first Bradbury that I read, but because that one I read in December of 22, I believe, it can't be on this list. But Fahrenheit 451 was fantastic, and definitely deserves to be on this top 10 of the year list.
Okay, so one of the books that I've read, I don't have a physical copy of it, is The Alloy of Law by Brandon Sanderson. I started reading this series of his, and the first book is the one I've enjoyed the most. I don't think I've completed the series yet.
I don't think so.
But I really love the first book. It was so much fun. I loved the characters. I loved the way that the magic worked, but also specifically how Brandon Sanderson didn't do what I thought he was going to do with the characters in the book. That was very satisfying.
Alright, so now we are into the 4 that are kind of basically all tied for number 1. I think there is a clear number 1, at least in my mind, but these 4 are all well-deserving. These are the 4 books that I have, throughout this year, been thinking, okay, I don't know that any of these books, that there's going to be a book that can top any of these ones, because they've all been so fantastic. And the first one that I have of those 4 that I'm going to show you is The Legend of Blackjack by A.R. Witham. This one is just one of the funnest fantasy stories that I've read in a very long time. It's a portal fantasy. It's YA, kind of, middle grade, kind of. It's a coming of age type story a little bit, but it's just the way that it was told and the world that was built. Everything about it was so much fun, and one of the funnest books that I've read, and that's why it makes it up here. I don't know if it story-wise is the best book ever, but it's just so much fun that I had to include it here.
So one of the other books I really enjoyed reading this year was Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. Sorry, I think I misspoke. It was such a thought-provoking book. I definitely cried in this one, and it's not a fun, lighthearted read by any means, but it was so thought-provoking, and that's something, if a book can make me stop and think and consider something, then it has a lot more merit in my eyes. So that was one that really hit hard, and I just thought it was super interesting.
We then have Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. I listened to this on audiobook because there's no way that I would have finished that in 2023 with the way that I was reading. But I had so much fun with this book. The audiobook is fantastic. The story is fantastic. There's so much depth and complexity to these characters and what they're going through, and that's what it is. It's a character-driven story with the events of various French Revolution time period stuff going on around them, and so it's that backdrop with, and it's not even the French Revolution, it's after that. It's stuff going on in France. Stuff going on in France that is political and dangerous and stuff like that. And it was such a good story, and I knew that I was going to enjoy the story. I've watched one adaptation at least in the past that I can't remember which one it was. And so I thought I knew the story a little bit, or I had some ideas of it, and those scenes that I remember from the movie were in the book, but they were far from the story of the book. Like, that was just a small piece of what was going on. With all that being said, this is one of the only books that I could ever recommend you read an abridged version, because it's overwritten, and there's passages, chapters that you could just cut completely, or cut to the very last couple of pages of, and still get the entire story, because it's just so much detail that is unnecessary to the plot of the story. It's great. It's so well written, but there is some unnecessary stuff. But even with all that, one of the best books that I read this year, for sure.
I also read Death and Daisies by Amanda Flower. This is actually book 2 in the Magic Garden Mystery series, but I read it before book 1 because I didn't realize it was the sequel, and I liked it better than any of the other books in the series. However, I did discover that I really love cozy mysteries, especially cozy murder mysteries, which I didn't really think I would, and I've been so hit or miss with mysteries lately, but apparently I really like cozy mysteries, so I've been enjoying Amanda Flower's writing.
And it is kind of sad to see this happen, but also kind of exciting at the same time. At least it made the list, and at least it made the top 10, and that is J.R.R. Tolkien's The Tales from the Perilous Realm. This is what I have in the number 2 slot. This is fantastic. These are a collection of Tolkien's short stories and some of his poetry and one of his essays. And it's all so good. His skill with writing, each of the stories feels completely different. One of them feels like another The Hobbit, and there's just so much in it for me to love, and it being Tolkien, I am predisposed to love it, and it just worked so well for me, just absolutely perfectly. But there's one book that I enjoyed more, and we will talk about that in a second.
So I also read Six Crimson Cranes by Elizabeth Lim. I love the magic in this book. I loved the family relationships, the main character's relationships with her brothers, and overall the story just felt different from a lot of young adult fiction and fantasy that I've read recently. So I really enjoyed it for that reason. A different setting, a different world, different focus on the characters and on what's going on in the world. So that was one of my top 10 as well.
And then the one that I think is the winner for a favorite book that I read this year is The Devil in the White City by Erik Larson. And what makes this strange for me is that it is a historical nonfiction, which I don't read very much. I like history, I don't dislike nonfiction, I just don't tend to read it very much. And this was amazing. The way that Larson was able to take an event, or rather two corresponding events, one of them being the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, and the other one being basically a serial killer, and incorporate them into a narrative that made sense, that was chock full of information, about the world at that time, about American culture, about the building of this fair, about the build up to it, about the events surrounding it, and how this serial killer could get away with everything that he's doing. It was so engagingly done, and just my favorite book of the year. And like, it's rare that something could beat out Tolkien for me, and it's really cool that this could do it.
The last book on my list here, definitely not the least favorite of the year, was The Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society by Mary Ann Schaefer and Annie Barrows. This is one of my favorite books I've read of the year. It's one of my all-time favorite historical fiction novels, and it's well known. Like, this is not some hidden book. There's a film adaptation that's very popular. This was far better than the book, or far better than the film. It was written through a series of letters and notes and transcripts, I believe, of even telephone calls and telegrams. So I really love reading books like that. It keeps my attention, and I think it's a neat opportunity to get inside of people's heads and their lifestyle and habits at the same time, along with just learning the story of the situation in the island. It was such a fun story, and World War II historical fiction has always been my favorite time frame of historical fiction, and it's rare that you find a book so well done.
So that is our wrap up for 2024.
Yes.
Thank you guys for watching and for joining us on this adventure. We will see you guys again next year. Stay warm.